The halls of Congress often serve as the stage for profound ideological clashes where the abstract nature of law meets the raw reality of human experience. During a recent oversight hearing that commanded national attention, Representative Lou Correa engaged in a rigorous line of questioning with Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem regarding current immigration enforcement paradigms. This encounter was not merely a bureaucratic exchange, but a pivotal moment that laid bare the internal tensions within the American executive branch. Through a meticulous presentation of video evidence and witness testimony, the proceedings shed light on a series of enforcement actions that challenged the traditional understanding of border security. The atmosphere in the room was palpably tense as the discourse shifted from statistical data to the lived realities of those caught in the machinery of federal oversight. Secretary Noem stood her ground, citing the imperative of national sovereignty and the necessity of maintaining a robust deterrent against illegal entry into the United States. However, the evidence introduced by the committee suggested a significant departure from the publicized focus on removing high-level criminal threats. Detailed accounts emerged of long-term legal residents and even United States citizens being subjected to aggressive detention protocols that appeared to bypass standard procedural safeguards. These revelations prompted a broader discussion about the ethical boundaries of internal enforcement and the potential for collateral damage within domestic communities. The hearing served as a crucible for examining whether the current methods of the Department of Homeland Security align with the foundational principles of American jurisprudence. One of the most striking aspects of the testimony involved the documented detention of military veterans who had previously served the nation with distinction and honor. Representative Correa highlighted several instances where individuals with no prior criminal records were swept up in operations purportedly designed to target dangerous fugitives. This discrepancy between the administration's stated priorities and the actual demographics of those detained became a central theme of the legislative inquiry. The narrative of targeting the worst of the worst was increasingly challenged by footage showing the apprehension of productive members of society. Such incidents raise critical questions about the criteria used by federal agents when executing high-stakes enforcement operations in the interior of the country. The emotional weight of the proceedings was amplified by the presence of community leaders, including several pastors who have long served as anchors for their local congregations. Their testimonies provided a stark contrast to the sterile language of policy memos and tactical reports often favored by government agencies. These religious leaders recounted the psychological toll on families when primary breadwinners are suddenly removed from their homes without clear legal justification. The ripple effects of these enforcement actions extend far beyond the individuals directly involved, impacting the social fabric and stability of entire neighborhoods. It became evident that the reach of these policies has touched sectors of the population that were previously considered beyond the scope of such intense scrutiny. Perhaps the most politically sensitive revelations concern the parents of active duty U.S. Marines who found themselves entangled in the web of immigration enforcement. These parents, whose children are currently deployed in service to the United States military, represent a demographic that commands significant public respect and political capital. The optics of federal agents detaining the family members of those fighting for the nation's security created a profound sense of irony and discomfort among the observers. This specific line of inquiry forced a confrontation regarding the definition of national interest and the loyalty owed to those who serve. It underscored a growing concern that the current enforcement trajectory may be undermining the very values that the military is sworn to protect. The legal arguments presented during the hearing focused on the potential for systemic constitutional violations inherent in broad-brush enforcement tactics. Scholars and legal experts pointed out that the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures remains a cornerstone of the American legal identity regardless of an individual's status. When enforcement priorities shift away from specific criminal targets toward general population groups, the risk of infringing upon these civil liberties increases exponentially. The debate transitioned from a question of policy effectiveness to one of fundamental legality and the preservation of the rule of law. Critics argued that the current approach risks creating a permanent underclass that lives in constant fear of state intervention without the promise of due process. From a resource management perspective, the hearing questioned the efficiency of diverting massive federal funding away from genuine threats to national security. The argument was made that every hour spent processing a nonviolent resident is an hour not spent tracking human traffickers or preventing international terrorism. This strategic misalignment suggests a potential vulnerability in the nation's broader defense posture as resources are spread thin across a wide and often non-threatening demographic. The testimony indicated that the focus on volume over severity might be a political calculation rather than a tactical necessity. This critique strikes at the heart of the Department of Homeland Security's mission and its stated goal of protecting the American people from significant harm. The testimony also delved into the procedural mechanics of how these enforcement operations are authorized and executed on the ground. Questions were raised about the training and oversight of agents who are tasked with interpreting complex and often shifting federal mandates. When the directive from the top emphasizes aggressive enforcement, there is a documented history of field officers pushing the boundaries of their legal authority. The lack of a clear and consistent prioritization framework can lead to arbitrary enforcement that varies significantly from one jurisdiction to another. This inconsistency not only creates legal uncertainty for residents, but also complicates the relationship between federal authorities and local law enforcement agencies. The role of video evidence in this hearing cannot be overstated as it provided an unfiltered look at the interactions between federal agents and the public. These visual records often captured moments of high tension where the power imbalance between the state and the individual was most visible. In many cases, the footage contradicted the official accounts provided in written reports, highlighting a need for greater body camera usage and transparency. The power of these images to shape public opinion and legislative response is a testament to the evolving nature of political accountability in the digital age. By bringing these interactions into the light of a public hearing, the committee aimed to bridge the gap between bureaucratic claims and reality. As the first phase of the analysis concludes, it is clear that the tension between security and liberty remains one of the most pressing issues in American political life. The questioning of Secretary Noem served as a microcosm of a much larger national debate regarding the soul of the country's immigration system. While the need for an orderly and secure border is universally acknowledged, the methods used to achieve that goal are subject to intense and necessary debate. The facts presented in the hearing suggest that the current path is fraught with legal challenges and moral complexities that require urgent attention. This investigation is far from over as the demand for accountability continues to grow within the halls of Congress and across the nation. The second phase of this investigative discourse moves beyond the surface of individual anecdotes and into the complex structural integrity of the American legal framework. As the dialogue between Representative Correa and Secretary Noem deepened, it became increasingly clear that the central point of contention was the interpretation of discretionary power. Under the United States legal system, the executive branch possesses a degree of latitude in how it prioritizes the enforcement of federal statutes. However, this discretion is not an absolute mandate and must always function within the guardrails established by the Bill of Rights and subsequent judicial precedents. The hearing sought to determine if the Department of Homeland Security had crossed a threshold where policy goals began to supersede fundamental constitutional protections. A primary concern voiced by constitutional scholars during the proceedings was the erosion of the Fourth Amendment within the context of internal enforcement zones. These zones, which technically extend a significant distance from the physical border, have become the staging ground for what many describe as warrantless intrusions. The evidence presented showed that the definition of reasonable suspicion has become dangerously elastic in the hands of field operatives seeking to meet enforcement quotas. When a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident is detained without a specific articulable reason, the very essence of American liberty is placed in jeopardy. This systematic broadening of authority suggests a shift toward a more paramilitary approach to domestic policing that many legislators find deeply unsettling. Secretary Noem, in her defense, argued that the fluidity of modern threats requires a more flexible and responsive enforcement posture than in previous decades. She maintained that the categorization of individuals as non-criminal does not inherently mean they do not pose a potential risk to the administrative order of the state. From the department's perspective, maintaining the integrity of the immigration system requires a comprehensive approach that includes all violators of federal law. This stance reflects a strict originalist interpretation of the statutes, where the letter of the law is applied with minimal regard for individual circumstances or social contributions. However, this rigid application often clashes with the equitable principles that have traditionally guided American justice and administrative law. The discussion then turned toward the Due Process Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments, which guarantees that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The video evidence captured instances where individuals were processed with such speed and lack of legal counsel that their ability to contest their detention was effectively neutralized. For legal residents who have built lives and businesses within the United States, the sudden loss of freedom without a meaningful hearing represents a catastrophic failure of the system. The hearing highlighted a growing trend of expedited removals that bypass the judicial oversight typically provided by immigration courts. This bypass mechanism, while efficient for the government, creates a high probability of irreversible errors and life-altering injustices. Furthermore, the tension between federal mandates and local community safety was brought into sharp focus through the testimony of various municipal leaders. Many local jurisdictions have found that aggressive federal intervention often hampers their own ability to solve serious crimes by creating a climate of fear and silence. When residents witness their neighbors or local religious leaders being apprehended by federal agents, they become far less likely to cooperate with local police. This breakdown in community trust is viewed by many as a net negative for public safety regardless of the number of administrative arrests made. The hearing forced a critical evaluation of whether the federal government's priorities are fundamentally at odds with the stability and security of the American interior. The financial architecture of these enforcement operations also came under intense scrutiny during the midsection of the Congressional hearing. Representative Correa pointed out that the cost of detaining and processing thousands of low-priority individuals runs into the billions of dollars annually. These are funds that many argue would be better utilized in upgrading technology at ports of entry or increasing the number of asylum officers. The current allocation of capital appears to favor high-visibility enforcement actions over the more tedious but necessary work of long-term border management. This fiscal critique suggests that the department may be prioritizing optics and political messaging over actual operational effectiveness. The psychological impact on the agents themselves was another nuanced topic that emerged from the broader investigation into the department's culture. Testimony suggested that the pressure to produce high arrest numbers can lead to burnout and a gradual dehumanization of the populations being policed. When the mission is framed in the language of a conflict or an invasion, the nuance required for fair and ethical enforcement is often lost. This cultural shift within the agency has long-term implications for how the United States is perceived both domestically and on the international stage. Ensuring that the men and women of federal law enforcement are guided by a clear ethical compass is essential for maintaining the legitimacy of the state. In response to the mounting evidence of procedural overreach, Secretary Noem emphasized the complexity of the operational environment faced by her personnel. She noted that agents often have only seconds to make life and death decisions in situations that are frequently volatile and unpredictable. The department maintains that any instances of misconduct are isolated incidents rather than a reflection of a systemic failure within the organization. However, the sheer volume of cases presented by the committee suggested a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as merely coincidental. The hearing underscored the need for a more robust internal affairs mechanism to investigate and remediate these types of grievances. The debate also touched upon the historical context of immigration enforcement in the United States, noting that every administration has struggled to find a balance. What makes the current era distinct is the level of technological surveillance and the speed at which information and enforcement can be deployed. This technological leap has given the executive branch unprecedented power to monitor and intervene in the lives of millions of people simultaneously. Without corresponding increases in legislative oversight and judicial review, this power risks becoming an instrument of arbitrary governance. The hearing served as a reminder that the tools of the state must always be subject to the consent and scrutiny of the governed. As we conclude this second segment of the analysis, the focus remains on the fragility of the rule of law when faced with political pressure. The clash between Representative Correa and Secretary Noem is a symptom of a deeper struggle to define the American identity in the 21st century. It is a struggle between the desire for absolute security and the commitment to the inherent dignity and rights of the individual. The facts brought to light in this session provide a sobering look at what happens when the machinery of the state operates without sufficient transparency. The next phase of this inquiry will delve into the specific legislative remedies and the potential for systemic reform. The third chapter of this political inquiry pivots toward the legislative response and the broader societal implications of the documented enforcement tactics. Following the intense exchange between Representative Correa and Secretary Noem, the focus of the committee shifted toward potential statutory remedies to prevent further executive overreach. Lawmakers began debating the necessity of a renewed legislative framework that would explicitly define the limits of federal authority in the interior of the country. This effort aims to codify protections that have previously relied on administrative grace rather than hard law. The goal is to ensure that future administrations, regardless of their political leanings, cannot weaponize the Department of Homeland Security against vulnerable populations. Public reaction to the hearing has been a complex mixture of alarm and demands for immediate accountability across the political spectrum. Advocacy groups and civil rights organizations have used the testimony to bolster their calls for a comprehensive overhaul of the immigration detention system. The stories of military families and religious leaders have resonated deeply with a public that often feels disconnected from the nuances of immigration policy. This surge in public awareness has put significant pressure on moderate legislators to take a more active role in oversight. It has become clear that the era of passive observation by the legislative branch regarding executive enforcement is likely coming to a close. On the international stage, the hearing has also raised concerns among diplomatic partners and human rights observers who monitor American civil liberties. The detention of legal residents and the perceived disregard for due process have been cited in several international reports as a troubling trend for a nation that champions the rule of law. These developments have complicated bilateral discussions on migration management and regional security cooperation within the Western Hemisphere. When the United States is seen as failing to uphold its own constitutional standards, it loses significant moral authority in its foreign policy endeavors. The hearing thus served as a mirror reflecting the global consequences of domestic policy choices. Inside the halls of the Department of Homeland Security, there are reports of internal friction as career officials grapple with the political directives of the leadership. Many long-term employees who have served under multiple administrations express concern that the current priorities are damaging the long-term reputation of the agency. The tension between political appointees and the civil service is a recurring theme in modern American governance, but it is particularly acute in the realm of national security. These internal leaks and whistle-blown reports have provided the committee with a roadmap for further investigation into the decision-making processes at the highest levels. This internal dissent suggests that the current enforcement model may be unsustainable even from within the bureaucracy. The role of the media in shaping the narrative around these enforcement actions has also been a subject of significant debate during the legislative session. While some outlets focused on the government's duty to secure the borders, others provided a platform for the voices of those who were detained and mistreated. This fractured media landscape has led to a polarized public understanding of the actual events that took place on the ground. However, the introduction of verified video evidence during the hearing provided a rare moment of objective reality that transcended partisan talking points. This reliance on visual documentation has become a critical tool for those seeking to hold the state accountable for its actions. Legislative proposals currently under consideration include the mandatory use of body-worn cameras for all federal agents involved in interior enforcement operations. There is also a push for the establishment of an independent oversight board with the power to subpoena department records and conduct unannounced inspections. Such measures are designed to create a culture of transparency that is currently lacking in the department's day-to-day operations. Furthermore, some legislators are advocating for a safe harbor provision that would protect military families and long-term residents from expedited removal proceedings. These proposals represent a significant attempt to rebalance the scales between state power and individual rights. The economic consequences of aggressive interior enforcement are also beginning to manifest in sectors that rely heavily on a stable workforce. Business leaders in agriculture, construction, and hospitality have warned that the current climate of fear is leading to labor shortages and economic instability. When productive residents are removed or forced into hiding, the entire local economy suffers through lost productivity and reduced consumer spending. The hearing touched upon these economic realities, noting that the cost of enforcement is not just measured in tax dollars, but in the health of American communities. This economic lens has brought a different set of stakeholders into the debate, including conservative business groups who previously remained silent. Secretary Noem's testimony continued to emphasize the administration's belief that a strong enforcement posture is the only effective way to manage the migration crisis. She argued that any perceived harshness is a direct result of the unprecedented volume of cases the department must handle on a daily basis. The department maintains that its agents are performing a difficult job under extreme duress and deserve the unwavering support of the public. This defense, however, often fails to address the specific instances of legal residents being targeted, which remains the most damaging aspect of the committee's findings. The clash of perspectives shows a fundamental disagreement on what constitutes a successful immigration policy. As we look toward the final stages of this investigation, the question remains whether the legislative branch has the political will to impose meaningful constraints on the executive. The history of the United States is marked by periodic expansions and contractions of executive power, often during times of perceived national crisis. The current era of immigration enforcement may be remembered as a high-water mark for federal authority in the interior. Whether this leads to a permanent shift in the American legal landscape or a corrective return to constitutional norms is the central question of our time. The evidence gathered so far suggests that the path forward will require a fundamental reassessment of how the nation defines security. This segment concludes our look at the legislative and societal reactions to the oversight hearing involving Secretary Noem. The dialogue has moved from the personal to the political and now to the systemic as we analyze the forces at play. The final sections will explore the long-term historical implications of these events and the potential for a new national consensus on immigration. The stakes could not be higher for the millions of people whose lives are directly impacted by these federal policies. As the committee prepares its final reports, the nation watches to see if accountability will finally be realized. The fourth chapter of this analysis examines the historical precedents and the technological evolution that have paved the way for current enforcement strategies. To understand the gravity of the exchange between Representative Correa and Secretary Noem, one must look back at how the American state has historically expanded its policing powers during times of perceived crisis. From the Alien and Sedition Acts of the late 18th century to the mass repatriations of the 1930s, the United States has a recurring history of prioritizing administrative control over civil liberties. However, the current era is distinct because of the unprecedented integration of digital surveillance and biometric data into the machinery of enforcement. These tools have granted federal agencies a level of visibility into the lives of residents that was once the stuff of science fiction. The hearing revealed that this technological reach is often used with little regard for the legal status or the criminal history of those being monitored. Modern enforcement relies heavily on interoperable databases that link local law enforcement records with federal immigration systems. This digital net often captures individuals for minor traffic violations or administrative errors, which then trigger aggressive federal intervention. Representative Correa pointed out that these automated systems frequently fail to distinguish between a dangerous fugitive and a lawful resident with an expired document. The black box nature of these algorithms means that individuals are often flagged without knowing why or how to challenge the underlying data. This lack of algorithmic transparency creates a new form of digital due process violation that the current legal system is ill-equipped to handle. The hearing underscored the danger of allowing automated systems to dictate the exercise of state force in civilian life. The deployment of advanced surveillance technology such as facial recognition and license plate readers has effectively turned many American cities into high-tech checkpoints. While the Department of Homeland Security argues that these tools are essential for identifying threats, the reality is that they create a dragnet that affects everyone. For military veterans and long-term residents who have lived in the shadow of these systems, the psychological impact is one of constant and pervasive anxiety. The footage presented during the hearing showed that agents often rely on these technological markers to justify stops and searches that would otherwise lack probable cause. This shift from human-centered policing to data-driven enforcement represents a fundamental change in the relationship between the government and the governed. It raises the question of whether an individual's right to privacy can survive in an environment of total federal awareness. Secretary Noem defended the use of these technologies as a necessary force multiplier in an era of limited human resources and evolving threats. She maintained that the department operates with strict internal guidelines to prevent the misuse of data and to protect the privacy of U.S. persons. However, the evidence of U.S. citizens being detained suggests that these safeguards are either insufficient or are being bypassed in the field. The committee's investigation found that the oversight of these digital tools is often reactive rather than proactive, occurring only after a significant violation has been brought to light. This reactive posture is inadequate for protecting the constitutional rights of a population that is increasingly under constant state observation. The hearing called for a comprehensive audit of all surveillance technologies currently deployed by the agency in the interior. The role of private contractors in providing the infrastructure for this surveillance state was another critical point of discussion in the fourth segment of the hearing. Many of the databases and monitoring tools used by federal agents are developed and maintained by private corporations that are not subject to the same transparency requirements as government agencies. This outsourcing of enforcement capabilities creates a layer of separation that makes it difficult for Congress to exercise effective oversight. It also raises concerns about the profit motives driving the expansion of surveillance and detention capacity. When the business of security is tied to the volume of data collected and individuals processed, the incentive for restraint is often diminished. The hearing highlighted the need for greater accountability for the private entities that profit from the execution of federal immigration policy. Furthermore, the historical comparison between current tactics and the civil rights struggles of the past was a recurring theme in the expert testimony. Many observers noted that the targeting of religious leaders and community organizers mirrors the efforts to suppress social movements in previous decades. By destabilizing the support networks of immigrant communities, the federal government is perceived as attempting to silence political dissent. Representative Correa argued that the enforcement of immigration law should not be used as a tool for social engineering or political intimidation. The integrity of a democracy depends on the ability of all residents to participate in civic life without the fear of arbitrary state retaliation. The hearing served as a stark reminder that the tools used against one group today can easily be used against another group tomorrow. The impact of these policies on the judicial system itself has been significant, with immigration dockets becoming increasingly overwhelmed by low-priority cases. This backlog prevents the courts from focusing on serious criminal matters and slows down the legal process for everyone involved. The strategy of mass enforcement without prioritization has led to a situation where the legal system is being used as a blunt instrument rather than a precise scalpel. This inefficiency is not just a logistical problem but a systemic failure that undermines the public's confidence in the fairness of the courts. The hearing suggested that the current approach is actually hindering the administration of justice by flooding the system with unnecessary litigation. It is a case where more enforcement has paradoxically led to less actual security and order. As the discussion moved toward the end of its fourth phase, the focus remained on the long-term consequences of a society that accepts high-intensity policing as the norm. The normalization of aggressive federal intervention in the interior of the country has profound implications for the future of American federalism. It challenges the traditional role of states and localities in managing their own safety and community standards. The hearing forced a confrontation with the reality that the border is no longer a geographic line but a legal status that follows individuals wherever they go. This expansion of the border zone into the heart of the country is one of the most significant legal developments of the post-9/11 era. The facts brought to light in this session serve as a warning about the fragility of liberty in an age of technological and political consolidation. The testimony ended with a call for a return to a more balanced and humane approach that recognizes the inherent dignity of all people. While the debate over policy will continue, the need for a system that respects the rule of law and the constitutional rights of everyone is paramount. The conflict between Secretary Noem's defense and Representative Correa's critique illustrates the deep divisions that remain in the American body politic. However, by bringing these issues into the light of a public hearing, the committee has provided a foundation for future reform. The final section of this analysis will explore the potential for a new consensus and the path toward a more just and effective system. The journey through the complexities of federal oversight continues to reveal the challenges of maintaining a free society. The final chapter of this investigation synthesizes the ethical dilemmas and systemic challenges that have come to define the modern American immigration landscape. As the oversight hearing drew to a close, the primary takeaway was not merely a dispute over policy details, but a fundamental disagreement over the national identity. The intense scrutiny of Secretary Noem by Representative Correa served as a catalyst for a broader conversation about what it means to be a nation of laws in an era of global displacement. It became clear that the current trajectory of the Department of Homeland Security requires more than just incremental adjustments to its operating manuals. The evidence suggests that a profound recalibration of the relationship between federal power and human rights is the only path toward long-term stability. This concluding phase of the inquiry looks toward a future where security and compassion are no longer treated as mutually exclusive concepts. A key element of this proposed future involves the reintroduction of prosecutorial discretion as a core principle of federal law enforcement. By empowering agents and attorneys to prioritize cases based on actual threats to public safety, the system can move away from the current model of mass administrative detention. This shift would allow the government to focus its immense resources on dismantling criminal syndicates and human trafficking networks rather than targeting productive residents. Such a change would not only improve operational efficiency but also restore a sense of fairness and common sense to the immigration process. The hearing demonstrated that when the law is applied without nuance, it often loses its legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Reclaiming that legitimacy is essential for the continued functioning of a democratic society that relies on the consent of the governed. The testimony also highlighted the urgent need for a more robust legal orientation program for those entering the immigration system. When individuals understand their rights and the procedures they are facing, the entire process becomes more orderly and less prone to the chaos witnessed in the video evidence. Investing in legal counsel and orientation services has been shown to increase appearance rates in court and reduce the overall burden on the detention infrastructure. This approach aligns with the American tradition of ensuring that every person has a fair day in court regardless of their background. It also provides a necessary check against the potential for administrative errors that can lead to the wrongful detention of citizens and legal residents. Moving toward a more transparent and accessible legal framework is a pragmatic solution to a deeply complex problem. Furthermore, the role of community-based alternatives to detention was presented as a viable and cost-effective path forward. Instead of relying on high-security facilities for nonviolent individuals, the government can utilize monitoring programs that allow families to remain together while their cases are adjudicated. These programs have demonstrated high success rates in ensuring compliance with federal requirements, while costing a fraction of the price of traditional incarceration. By treating immigration as a civil administrative matter rather than a criminal one, the state can avoid the traumatic social consequences detailed during the hearing. This shift would also alleviate the pressure on federal agents who are currently forced to act as jailers rather than investigators. A more humane approach to processing can coexist with the necessary requirements of national sovereignty and border integrity. The enduring impact of this hearing will likely be felt in the upcoming legislative cycles as new bills are drafted to codify these reforms. The bipartisan concern regarding the detention of military families suggests that there is a narrow but significant window for legislative action. Reformers are looking to establish clear, sensitive location policies that would protect places of worship, schools, and medical facilities from enforcement actions. Such protections would ensure that the basic functions of a healthy society are not disrupted by the pursuit of administrative quotas. The hearing has provided the political momentum needed to move these ideas from the fringe of the debate to the center of the legislative agenda. It is a reminder that in the American system of government oversight is the first step toward meaningful change. In her closing remarks, Secretary Noem reiterated her commitment to the mission of the department, while acknowledging the gravity of the concerns raised by the committee. She emphasized that the men and women of the DHS are dedicated public servants who often work in thankless conditions to keep the country safe. While the friction between the executive branch and the legislature is a design feature of the Constitution, it remains to be seen how the department will integrate the lessons of this hearing. The call for increased transparency and accountability is unlikely to fade, and the department's future credibility depends on its response to these criticisms. The dialogue initiated in this room must now be translated into tangible changes in how agents operate in communities across the nation. The historical record will view this moment as a critical test of the resilience of American civil liberties in the 21st century. The courage of the witnesses who came forward to share their stories of detention and mistreatment has provided a human face to a complex legal issue. Their testimonies have challenged the sterile narrative of federal policy and forced a national reckoning with the consequences of our enforcement choices. Representative Correa's persistent questioning has ensured that these voices were not ignored but were instead entered into the official record of the United States Congress. This act of legislative oversight serves as a vital safeguard against the slow drift toward authoritarian practices in the name of security. The pursuit of a more perfect union continues through the rigorous examination of our own institutions. As we conclude this comprehensive analysis, the central theme remains the necessity of balancing power with responsibility. The American experiment is defined by its ability to self-correct when its actions deviate from its founding principles of liberty and justice for all. The facts brought to light during the exchange between Lou Correa and Kristi Noem have provided the map for that correction. It is now up to the people and their representatives to decide whether to follow the path toward reform or to continue down the road of unbridled enforcement. The stakes involve not just the lives of the individuals caught in the system, but the very character of the nation itself. The work of ensuring that our laws reflect our values is never truly finished, but this hearing represents a significant step in that ongoing journey.